Okay, so I just see we're just past the 20 minutes past one mark. I'll take this opportunity to begin. Um, Thanks very much to everybody who's been able to join this presentation this afternoon. I wish you a very warm welcome. And welcome to this session. For those who haven't managed to join the conference so far, welcome to day 2 and this session of Powering Supply Chain Resilience, the TAPA EMEA conference. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity that TAPA has presented to me to discuss with you guys and present in a little bit more detail the hot topic, I guess, at the moment, which is bogus transport operators. And also, what I wanted to do was just use this opportunity to discuss the threat that these bogus operators present to our supply chains. Some of the challenges and issues that we need to manage as a result, but also maybe some of the best practice guidance that we could possibly consider or adopt to tackle this challenging issue. So I'll just start by introducing myself. So my name's Andy Griffiths. I'm the security manager for Mondelez Europe. So Mondelez is a global food manufacturing and beverage business. I'm also the lead for the TAPA EMEA Fake Intelligence Group, and it's in that capacity that I present to you today. In terms of my experience and background, so I have over 30 years of experience, predominantly within law enforcement. So I do come from a complex crime investigation and fraud background. So this is a particular subject that is of interest to me, and it's something actually that I'm very passionate about. But I also bring to the conference experience in relation, of managing various different supply chain risks, including manufacturing, transport, and supply chain logistics. I think it's important that I put a bit of context with regards to my experience, because it will go some way to explain some of the comments that I made during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A, and you are more than welcome to ask any questions that you may have at the end of today's discussion. And of course, I'm available for future contact as well if you wish to discuss either this topic or the activities of the Fake Carrier Crime Intelligence Group going forwards. So on that note, I'll begin. So although it's fair to say criminals posing as bogus freight companies is nothing new. In fact, it's something we've seen for many years. And this is a problem that is increasingly affecting many member organizations. And it's something that, certainly as manufacturers of products or goods, we've seen an increase of in terms of the numbers of reported incidents and attempts to steal from our supply chains and locations. But also, this is an issue that appears to be affecting many smaller transport companies or transport providers. And so I thought, this was it's an ongoing issue. It is increasing, and certainly supply chains are increasingly impacted by this very important topic. And so I thought it was a really good opportunity to discuss, our experiences, not just at Mondelez, but also as an industry partner with TAPA EMEA and its members. So just to give you an overview of the presentation, together during this presentation, we'll examine an apparent rise in the numbers of reported bogus carrier incidents within the EMEA region. And I want to take some time to go through and discuss the methodology behind some of the crimes that certainly we've seen within our supply chain, and I guess which you guys have experienced out there in the wider industry. Other topics that we'll discuss during this presentation will include the challenges faced by investigators. So with reference to investigators, I mean both internal, so you guys out there on the ground doing the job, but also police, law enforcement investigators, and also their partner agencies, because investigations tend to be quite holistic. We'll look at the importance of effective carrier due diligence, and really, in doing so, we'll look to promote the benefits of a collaborative approach, not just when an incident happens, but also during post-incident investigations, because this is really important. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, it's really important, and it's a massive thank you to the TAPA EMEA team, and that they have recognised the importance of this subject and topic, and that they have chosen to support this group in terms of a special interest group. The group itself enjoys a growing membership of transport providers, manufacturers, various members of insurance groups, and representatives from law enforcement and their partner agencies. So this is not just a Mondelez or transport venture. This is an holistic approach to tackling what is perceived by many as to be quite a serious problem. Okay, so what I'd like to do is kind of set the scene. So let's discuss for a short time what the issues are, and let's try and understand a bit more about the criminal actors that are involved in using or portraying themselves to be legitimate operators. So as supply chains rebound from the COVID pandemic towards something that resembles business as usual, driven by market forces, many of us face a new set of challenges, threats, and risks. And these vary and range from truck availability and low capacity issues or concerns, driver shortages, which we're all aware of. And if you combine these with increased consumer demand for products and goods, and the constant drive by everyone to drive down transportation costs. These are really challenging and dynamic times for everybody within the industry. But I do think it's important from the outset to understand, the criminal mindset, the mentality behind the formation of bogus operators. This is a really important thing that we need to consider. It's important to understand that criminal businesses are the same as any other legitimate enterprise. They are definitely entrepreneurial. They're typically opportunistic, and they are extremely market focused. So they are the criminal mirror, if you like, of a legitimate business or enterprise for whom we all work for. It's important to understand also that they operate at minimal risk to their organization. So, they ply their trade across international borders, multiple jurisdictions, often using a range of new and sophisticated technologies. And typically this will involve fraud and internet-enabled attacks, so that they can hide behind the shadows, keep themselves anonymous, and prevent themselves from being discovered or arrested in the future. The real wake up for me is and I think this is the harsh reality, is that criminals understand where our supply chain vulnerabilities exist, and more importantly, they know exactly how to exploit them. And that's a really important concept when we're trying to understand some of the crime methodologies and the threat behind the risks that we manage in relation to bogus operators. So let's examine this statement in a bit more detail. There are several factors which, in my opinion, allow criminal gangs to operate in this way, and I'm sure between us we can all think of many others. Firstly, there is a wide-reaching perception that cargo theft, cargo crime, is a victimless crime, and because of this, incidents involving bogus operators are likely, and I think this is very typical, underreported. Or if they are reported, in some case, they may not be fully investigated. So in short, the complex nature of these investigations means they often end up in the too difficult to deal with pile, both internally as the organisation that's doing the internal investigation, but also for law enforcement as well. And this is a deliberate tactic by organised crime or those operating within the bogus operator or carrier arena. And they try to make things overly complex and difficult for investigators. And this is a subject that we'll touch on in more detail during this investigation. Now, taking all of these factors into consideration, it's likely that early opportunities to detect crimes involving bogus operators and to apprehend those responsible, and also to prevent future incidents may be missed. So, these are really, really important points. I think secondly, certainly within the industry and coming from a law enforcement background as well, there is a general perception or acknowledgement that the approach to investigations, especially cross-border crimes, international crimes, is fragmented, and especially where organized crime groups move freely between international borders or overcomplicate things by locating themselves in different areas of the region. And this is something that we definitely need to bear in mind when we consider some of the challenges in investigating, and also highlighting the importance of collaboration between the different investigative groups that are involved in these investigations. And finally, for commercial, brand and business reputational reasons, the details of many crimes involving bogus operators are not widely circulated or shared. And this can be a barrier, especially to other businesses who are suffering from the same issues, to understanding the extent of the threat or the problem that we face. Because of these and other factors, the risk exposure for criminal gangs it's attractively low. Whilst at the same time the financial gains from the crimes they commit are extremely high. In many cases, there is also little chance that crime groups' senior leadership will be directly linked to an individual crime, and I'll come on to the reasons why in subsequent slides during this presentation. And it's fair to say that even when they are caught or investigated, or in fact convicted, the criminal sanctions, for example, the jail time or fines, are extremely low because of the perception of cargo crime in terms of the harm threat to the region or the communities in which we work. Quite frankly, to organised crime, it's a risk worth taking. Why wouldn't you? Okay, so for this next slide, I'd like to refer back to the earlier statement that I made, that criminals understand where our supply chain vulnerabilities exist and how best to exploit them. And this is a common theme that I'll come back to time and time again during this presentation. And it's important to understand this, because if we understand this, we start to think like a criminal. We start to examine our supply chains in terms of its gaps and vulnerabilities, how the criminal would view them. And this going forwards gives us a greater and much better understanding of what mitigating actions or measures we need to take going forwards. The key to understanding the extent of the threat is to acknowledge the dynamic nature of market forces that underpin global supply chains, and how this translates into risk, vulnerabilities, and more importantly, opportunities for organised crime. This is particularly relevant for organisations who outsource their transportation, as they may be compelled to source additional freight capacity via the spot market or any one of the European online freight auction sites. For these businesses, the primary aim is to move freight as efficiently and as cheaply as possible. I think it's important to say at this stage as well that for the larger transport providers who operate their own large fleets, this is less of a risk, and there's less of a need to subcontract and take the chances that manufacturers or those who outsource their transportation need to take. And I think this is a really important point. So, the issue and the threats posed by bogus operators doesn't necessarily affect everybody, but it is necessarily a growing threat that we are all seeing. So at this stage, and again, I think this is another really important point, is that it's important to say the use of freight exchanges in this way is an everyday occurrence. For almost all businesses that use them, the transactions are completed without issue. But having said this, the use of such platforms doesn't come without its risks. This statement is particularly relevant for organisations who rely on contracted transport providers to deliver their goods, and who rely on the same to conduct subcontractor due diligence on their behalf. This arrangement can be particularly problematic when the procuring company's security expectations and requirements are not fully met. And an example might be when a load is subcontracted multiple times, often referred to as multi-layer subcontracting. And for whatever reason, the required level of due diligence outlined by the procuring company is not performed. There are also, or there may also be circumstances where transport providers is at least in the short term unable to meet their customers' freight capacity demands. And in this example, the risk of contract non-compliance may be a financial penalty, or the risk of an incurred insurance liability following a loss may be, to some of these companies, an acceptable risk to take. So, it's really important that we not only do we understand the threat posed by bogus carrier operators, but we also understand some of the mechanisms by which they exploit our supply chains, but also some of the market conditions that create the circumstances in which, some of these thefts occur. And these are really important points. Okay, so the next slide, I'd like to talk a bit about the kind of the methodologies behind some of the crimes, and I base the comments that I make on the experiences that within our supply chain we've seen. Some of the experiences shared by members of the fake carrier group already, following various one-to-ones that we've had. And also I draw on experience of some of my law enforcement colleagues and some of their partner agencies. So, wherever we comment on sort of methodologies or methods of crime, we try and draw as much experience from different organizations as possible, because it's important that we do so. So since TAPA first highlighted the problem of bogus carriers in its 2016 Vigilant article, the industry has observed the use of various fraud techniques by several different criminal groups or individual criminal members masquerading as legitimate transport operators. Now, the range of techniques used by criminals continue to evolve, and they evolve as fast as we identify a certain crime methodology. And inevitably, they tend to be one step ahead of us, which is a real challenge. And this is something that I'll talk about later on during this presentation. But what I'd like to do is share with you, based on our experiences and those of our members, 4 different scenarios that you may see when investigating bogus operators within your supply chain. So scenario 1 is where an organization presents themselves as an entirely fictitious transport company. So this is something that's completely made up. It's usually supported by a fake website, maybe a false company address, and also often supported by fraudulent or false documentation. But it's something that we do see. These organizations tend to be fairly easily picked up with a degree of proper due diligence checks, but they do rely on those due diligence checks not taking place, and in doing so may exploit gaps where we assume that they are a legitimate and approved company to conduct business with. The second scenario is where a criminal organization assume the identity of a legitimate trading company. Now, this may be where the criminals take over or assume the identity of a legitimate carrier. So in effect, you have a cloned business operating as a legitimate business. And typically, what happens here is that a carrier believes they're doing business with a legitimate business of that name, when in fact what they're doing is they're operating and doing business with a criminal gang who have assumed that legitimate business's identity. And again, similarly, we tend to see these organizations supported or underpinned by a degree or various different fraudulent applications and techniques. including fake websites, company addresses, and also fake offices. So there is a degree of complexity and sophisticatedness around some of the structures behind these operations. Scenario 3 is where operating as a legitimate business but with fraudulent intentions. This technique often catches transport providers out because, again, they know this entity to be a trusted partner with whom they've frequently done business before. What they don't know is that the business has gone bad. And this may be because the owners have got into some financial difficulty, or they themselves have been infiltrated by a criminal organisation. And finally, scenario 4, known as driver call diversions, is when criminals provide false delivery instructions to a driver. This is normally kind of a freight auction enabled scenario where the criminal gang or organisation poses as a freight forwarder, matching a legitimate haulier to a shipper. In these circumstances, the criminal effectively acts as a middleman between the two entities, arranging the collection and also directing the driver at the same time. Once the driver has collected the goods, the criminal gang then provides a new delivery instructions, and then obviously the load is stolen and delivered to a new address. This technique relies on the different entities involved, so the driver, the shipper, and being out of contact from each other, so not being able to speak to each other, because obviously if they are in contact, then obviously the fraud or the theft could be discovered. Now, when committing acts of theft, bogus operators also deploy, as we said before, a range of fraud techniques, including the use of falsified documents to facilitate their crimes. These documents may include false insurance certificates, transport licenses, truck driver registration certificates, and driver ID documents. Now, as we discussed during the previous slide, many organisations who outsource their transportation increasingly rely on the spot market and also on online freight auction sites. And for this reason, criminal organisations deliberately focus their activities in these key areas, often exploiting vulnerabilities and gaps within the organisation's due diligence check procedures. And when I say the organisation, I mean the freight auction sites and also the organisations that are also procuring transportation. And this goes back to my original statement. Criminals know our vulnerabilities and they know how to exploit them. Now, because of the methodology behind these crimes and also the sophisticated way that crime groups infiltrate the different platforms involved, often the first time that a business realizes they've been targeted is when, after a load collection, contact is lost with the driver and the load is reported as stolen. Now, although difficult to detect on the ground, there are red flag indicators that can help identify a theft before it occurs, and we'll look at some specific examples. So, some examples that you may want to look out for include last-minute changes to contact details, changes to company official names, so changes from the original details listed with the different companies' houses or regulatory authorities to which companies are registered. We see very slight changes to emails, and also common are changes to landline and mobile telephone numbers. So, these very small, simple changes are very easy ways that organised crime can both infiltrate and steal loads from within your respective supply chains. With simple due diligence checks in place, they are very easy to identify often, and in doing so, it's very easy to prevent a theft. But you've got to have these due diligence checks in place, and you've got to make sure that they are being conducted at all levels, especially where the load has been subcontracted either to an improved or unimproved transport operator. In addition to the known red flags, investigators, law enforcement and transport providers also share the details of recent incidents via a network of fraud bulletins and alerts. Now, these alerts are invaluable, and I'm sure many of you already received them because they provide vital information about the crime methodologies, and those involved. And for many organisations, this information is the first time they are aware of the specific bogus carrier operating within their supply chains. Now, as we've already discussed, these red flags can be countered by effective due diligence, truck and driver verification procedures. And what I would do is I'd like to refer members back to the guidance that was given on this subject back in the July edition of TAPA Vigilant magazine. This was when we, as a manufacturer, raised with TAPA members what we perceive to be an increased threat from bogus operators. And within the article, we find examples of online security best practice, which actually was provided to us by a TAPA member who has successfully eradicated the problem from their supply chain. So if you get a chance, guys, have a look at this document. There's some really good guidance and advice. And by following the steps outlined within this edition, within this document, you won't go far wrong. Okay, so the next slide focuses on some of the challenges faced by those investigating bogus carrier operations. And again, I draw on my experience as an industry investigator, as an internal investigator, but also many years working within law enforcement as well. So as we've already discussed, organised crime by its very nature is often complex, operating across domestic and international borders. And it's fair to say that criminal gangs are aware of our enforcement capabilities, both within the industry and also law enforcement, because believe it or not, they keep an eye on what we do and how we operate. And because of this, they effectively exploit what some or many believe or perceive to be a fragmented approach to cross-border both industry and law enforcement investigations. So this is quite a sweeping statement, and I think it's important that maybe I just take a little bit of time just to clarify what I mean here. So it's fair to say that many investigators have an extremely good relationship with their counterparts in law enforcement and also their partner agencies. They work closely together on many bogus carrier cases and are considered by each other as trusted sources of information. And, you know, those relationships work very, very well. And because of this, the level of cooperation, both the flow of intelligence and the collaboration opportunities, both formal and informal, are generally really good. But it has to be said, the same cannot always be said about cross-border investigations, where for various different reasons, opportunities to work collaboratively may be restricted due to a range of different factors. And these can be, you know, many different policing agencies and forces have different policing priorities. And this goes back to my original statement around the perception of cargo theft in terms of risk, harm, impact. The availability of policing resource. So obviously the larger forces or the more regional forces have greater resource and can allocate that resource in more volume to bogus crime investigations, but obviously the smaller forces can't. And also factors like organisational culture, to a lesser degree maybe politics, and also we often hear the interpretation of local laws and regulation as being a barrier to supporting either investigations or exchanging information or intelligence across regional boundaries. So for this reason, the same level of cooperation and coordination cannot always be guaranteed at a regional or international level. So this is why we refer to the perception of a fragmented approach, or, you know, whilst you know, locally investigators, law enforcement work very well and very closely together, on a regional level it's not so coordinated. And this again is for me is a key takeaway from this presentation. It's something that we'll build on future calls. So from a business perspective, we often see the same challenges for investigators. So this is internally. For example, an organization's ability or appetite to share crime intelligence may be influenced by business culture. Definitely organizational politics sometimes is a factor. Commercial brand and reputational risk concerns definitely impact on our ability to share intelligence or freight crime intelligence. These are all factors that when taken into account means that some fraud or bogus operator investigations or incidents go under the radar. And I guess the impact of this is that new opportunities to both identify new and linked theft fraud cases, but also opportunities to apprehend cross-border offenders may be missed. So, this is definitely a gap area that, as an organisation, as the Fake Crime Carrier Intelligence Group, we'd like to build on with law enforcement and also on future discussions. So next slide, we'll talk about the collaborative approach that we're looking to promote as part of this TAPA EMEA group. So the challenges faced by both businesses and investigators alike definitely highlight the need for greater collaboration and coordination between all of the relevant stakeholders. So all of those involved in freight crime investigations and reporting. For example, the timely sharing of fraud intelligence will provide greater visibility at both the operational and tactical levels for many member organizations. This willingness to share intelligence between organizations will help to them and also us to better understand the latest attack methodologies, because bearing in mind, these are evolving all of the time. Criminals are exploiting new and existing technologies, and no one attack typically looks the same. So it's important we learn, and we learn quickly. Also, having understood the latest attack methodologies, it's important that we then use these learnings to understand the risks and then mitigate these more effectively, and to reduce these losses or our overall losses to malicious acts of theft and fraud. Other benefits of this approach include the early identification of red flag indicators, such as abused company details, false truck and trailer registration plates, and also driver ID documents. Now, armed with this information, member organisations are better placed to implement meaningful preventative measures, such as truck refusal procedures at the point of entry, thereby preventing a theft before it happens. This approach will also allow our members to exploit post-incident learning opportunities to better understand our supply chain vulnerabilities and risks, our control gaps, and to continually improve our operational security programs. So having said this, it is crucial intelligence is both sanitized to protect the original source and shared confidentiality within a trusted industry network, thereby providing an appropriate level of protection for all of the parties involved in the exchange of freight crime information and intelligence. Now, to maintain the integrity of the information provided, it's imperative intelligence, whenever possible, is independently verified. And only disclosed in a manner which doesn't compromise a live investigation. And for this reason, a high level of cooperation between industry and law enforcement investigators is essential to ensure the integrity of the investigation is maintained. Sorry, Sam.
Don't worry, Andy, but we are getting very close to the end. So maybe if you could just sort of cover your last slide. I know it's tight to finish. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. So what we'd like to do is just move on just to talk a little bit about the Fake Carrier Intelligence Group. So following a series of bogus carrier incidents during 2021, we as a company reevaluated our own transport security program to understand what best practice looks like. And we wanted to understand, whether this was just an issue that was limited to our supply chain or much of a wider issue. So following a series of incidents within our supply chain, we reached out to industry peers and we contacted various individuals within law enforcement, insurance organisations, in order to understand, whether, understand the threat and also the extent of it. And it became increasingly obvious that this wasn't just limited to our organisation. So armed with this information, we initially formed the informal group, the Fake Carrier Intelligence Group, and we sought to raise the issue as a profile with the support of TAPA EMEA, both within the July and September editions of the Vigilant magazine. And I'm really pleased to say that in September of this year, TAPA EMEA formally adopted the group as a special interest group. We've moved on significantly in the last few sort of weeks, and we now have 50 plus members representing transport operators, industry regulators, insurance companies, and also law enforcement. And the group is growing in terms of its influence and also its impact on this important topic. So, we've made some significant progress. In terms of the group's agenda, they're very clearly set out on this slide. So we're looking to raise industry awareness, to identify and share examples of industry best practice, but to address many of the gaps and issues that we identified on the previous slides in terms of law enforcement and industry engagement. We're also looking to significantly increase incident reporting, but to utilise, organisations like TAPA to do that in a safe, secure, and sensitive way that doesn't compromise brand or commercial sensitivities. But I guess the overall kind of strategic aim and objective of the group is to reduce industry losses, and I think this is a common factor when we're considering both TAPA and sort of the group's activities.
Thank you, Andy. I think we are going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much. And we've had lots of questions coming in whilst you've been speaking, lots of great questions, but we will also definitely cover those in the Vigilant magazine. It's going to be a bumper edition, I think.